Greetings, Pathfinders! Today's Absalom Archives is biology. We'll be going over the many creatures that Pathfinder has for players and game masters to use. As with all my series, we'll start broad and work our way to the specifics in future videos. And our broad topic today is the core playable ancestries that Pathfinder has to offer. So what do I mean by core ancestry? Well, the ones in the Pathfinder core rulebook, of course. But that's not a good answer, is it? After all, there have been 3 core rulebooks in Pathfinder's lifespan, and each one has had a different roster of ancestries in it. So let's go over what was in each book and which ancestries we will and will not be covering here. Pathfinder 1st Edition launched with 7 ancestries, and they were all the ones from D&D 3.5. While Pathfinder's lore is original, 1st Edition's mechanical bones are still pretty obvious if you know where to look. But if you aren't the kind of nerd who's had this list memorized for over a decade, these ancestries were Dwarf, Elf, Gnome, Half-Elf, Half-Orc, Halfling, and Human. We've got all the fantasy basics here, nothing too crazy on the surface. I do think it's funny that just about half of these ancestries literally contain the word half in their name, and because of that, over half of them start with H. Still, these 7 are your pretty basic ancestries, and we'll be including them in this video. Kind of. Half-Elf and Half-Orc are going to be discussed a little differently. Before we go over why, let's go over who gets added with 2nd edition. Pathfinder's approach to goblins was quite well received during 1st edition, and they became a mascot for the company. As a result, goblins got added as a core ancestry during 2nd edition, something that I assure you I was incredibly unbiased about. We then got the remastered player core, which added orcs and leshies as ancestries, so we'll be covering each of these too, right? Well, no. We won't be covering leshy in this video. Don't get me wrong, they are really cool and I want to talk about them. For context, leshy are primal spirits that animate plant bodies, and yes, they are adorable. But they are also pretty different from the other ancestries. They haven't made the same historical impact and don't have as much of a centralized culture. I think they're better saved for another video. There are a few others we won't be covering, but to explain that, we're going to have to talk about game mechanics. In 1st edition, every ancestry was its own separate thing. Some had crossover points, like how half-elves were treated as humans and elves for the purposes of some effects, but that's about it. 2nd edition changed that with the introduction of a heritage. Think of it like a subdivision in each ancestry. All ancestries have their own unique heritages, but there's also versatile heritages. These are designed to represent ancestries that are either a mix between 2 other ancestries or else have some kind of outside influence affecting them. If you're familiar with the Aasimar or Tieflings from D&D, those fit here. They were separate heritages until the remaster, which combined them under the Nephilim umbrella. Half-elves and half-orcs were also put into this category. Oh, and the remaster gave them specific terms rather than just half whichever. When it comes to heritages, I will be covering half-elves and half-orcs, but not any of the other ones. Like the Leshy, I feel they are better saved for another video. So with that in mind, here's our lineup of ancestries. Dwarves, Elves, Ivarans, aka half-elves, Orcs, Dromar, aka half-orcs, Gnomes, Goblins, Halflings, and Humans. This time we won't be going entirely in alphabetical order. I want to end on humans because they're going to be the shortest and the least involved. Everything else? Just kind of vibes, honestly. We'll briefly touch on the ancestry's history, but I won't go super in-depth. That's for a dedicated video. And remember, this is all at the start of our timeline. That shouldn't matter as much, but keep it in mind. With that, I think we're done with the preamble. It's time to get into some juicy lore. Which means here's the part where I trail off after saying we're going to start with... dwarves. I'd lead with a joke, but I already used rock and stone and don't tell the elf, so my dwarf joke keg is pretty tapped out. I'm not sorry. Anyway, dwarves. You probably think you know dwarves. You've seen some portion of Lord of the Rings, or played WoW, or any of the million other references I could make. At first glance, Pathfinder doesn't seem to stray too far from this. I mean, look at this guy. But to torture a metaphor, dwarves are a lot like rocks. The surface looks the same, but if you know what you're looking for and dig in a bit, you'll find so much more than what you first saw. So let's go back to the beginning and see how the dwarves advanced throughout their history. Dwarves believe they were created by the god Torag, who forged them from the sparks of his anvil. Physically, they are shorter and more stocky than humans. Dwarves average about 4 feet in height. Skin color has a similar range to humans, with the dwarves of Avestan being paler, while Gurundi dwarves have a darker complexion. And of course, we have the beards. While they aren't universal, it's incredibly common for dwarves of all genders to grow large, impressive beards. The dwarves' history is largely defined by their migration from the Darklands to the surface. Called the Quest for the Sky, it saw them undergo a 300-year migration away from their ancient homes at the behest of their god Torag. The dwarves that remained behind would submit to the dark god Droskar and become the Hringar, but that's a story for another time. It also drove the orcs to the surface ahead of them, which we'll cover in the orc section. For the dwarves that emerged, they built large fortified cities called Sky Citadels. The Sky Citadels are, in a way, a signifier of dwarven culture. Large, imposing, traditional, and a lot less stable than they seem. 4 of the 10 have been completely lost. 1 barely has a stable population, and the rest are highly isolated. Some cling to these traditions, trying to reclaim former glory, while others believe in forging a new path for the dwarven people going forward. Today, the dwarves can be divided into 3 different groups. The Grodexen, underground dwarves that live, well, underground obviously, the Holtuxen, who live in the mountain enclaves, and the Ergaxen, who live on the surface. We'll dig into each of these groups and see what makes them unique, but before we do that, let's touch on some commonalities that all of them share. Dwarves focus heavily on culture, tradition, and history. Some are more conservative about this, but they all hold a deep appreciation for the works and actions of their ancestors. Extended family is very important, and dwarves keep detailed records of family trees going back generations, often carved into stones near their living space. This is also why dwarven craft is seen as sturdy and lasting. It's seen as a way to make your mark on the world and pass down something that will be remembered. The most significant aspect of this is the clan dagger. Dwarven infants will have a member of their clan, the extended family unit, forge a dagger for the child. This dagger will be used to cut the umbilical cord, welcoming the infant into the world. It is given to the child when they come of age to keep for the rest of their life. The hilt of these daggers bear a gemstone, the type and cut unique to their clan, that are ritually infused with a spark. That spark is kept until the dwarf leaves the clan. This can be for happy reasons like marriage or adoption, or less savory ones like banishment or death. Losing the dagger is considered a great shame, and a clan dwarf will almost never sell it. The shame is that great. Dwarves born outside the clan system can enter one and receive a dagger, though this is rare unless that dwarf proves themselves truly exceptional. A small number of dwarves from the remote Dongan Hold have modified this tradition to fit their firearms, having clan pistols instead. For most dwarves, though, the traditional dagger is the only thing suitable. With those common elements covered, let's go into details. We'll begin with the Grodexen, the underground dwarves. They are the most traditional of the dwarven subcultures, so traditional they think even living on the surface is too modern. They don't reject the quest for the sky, but they also don't think the point was to stay on the surface. Rather, they were supposed to travel up, but not live there. Underground dwarves live on a very different life cycle from surface dwellers, not depending on the sun. They instead have 32-hour days, called Forge Days, with a 20-hour active period and 12 hours of rest. Being located primarily underground, the Grodexen have very limited contact with the surface. Their main contact is from the surface dwarves, who return underground every 24 Forge Days, aka about once a month, with news. They otherwise ignore the surface world, focusing on preserving dwarven history, tradition, and crafts. While they could be scattered all over the Inner Sea, the largest concentration lives in a vast tunnel network beneath the undead nation of Geb. Called the Kulanet, they live nomadically with only the barest contact with the nation above them. Moving on to the mountains, we have the Holtuxen. These are the dwarves you'll find still manning the sky citadels and any surrounding satellite locations. The inheritors of their ancestors' greatest accomplishment, the mountain dwarves often strive to relive the glory days of the quest for the sky. Like most historical achievements, the difficulty and pain from that time has been long forgotten, only the glory and legends remaining to spur on a new generation. The fact that 4 of their sky citadels have been lost does not help things. Kuldakar fell to the Orcs centuries ago, and Jormungandr and Sarkoris fell to Hringar attack long before the World Wound opening made returning nearly impossible. 2 other citadels have been lost for so long their names have been lost as well. Kravenkus and Taldor has a population of less than 3,000 and little hope of turning things around. Cloudspire and the Mwangi Expanse, Donganhold and Alkenstar, Janderhof and Varesia, and Kraken and Nirmithras still hold on, while High Helm in the Five Kings Mountains remains a de facto capital for the mountain dwarves. While heavily fortified, the dwarves within are yearning for the glory they once knew. This leads them to adventure and explore, but also take risks that cut their best and brightest down before they can achieve their full potential. It also makes them more militant and aggressive, striking out at ancient enemies like orcs or giants when that might not be the most advisable tactic. Lastly, we have the Ergaxen, the surface dwarves. Little tip, don't call them that. While the other 2 groups see them as a unified ethnic group, the Ergaxen do not. They consider themselves to be several separate ethnic groups that are only grouped into the surface dwarf label by virtue of not being part of the 2 other groups. While there are Ergaxen communities across the Inner Sea, most of them are based in Garund, both in the northern desert and deeper in the Mwangi Expanse. The northern desert groups include the Pamet of Assyrian, who tend ancient necropolises that dot the landscape, having served the ancient pharaohs and preserved Assyrians' many traditions throughout Khadiran occupation. Assyrian also has the Owat, a monastic group that dedicate themselves to self-perfection. To the east in Kadira, the Parahin act as independent business owners, operating forges and shops within the capital of Kathir. To the west in Rahadum, the Vahird are another monastic group dedicated to the laws of morality, acknowledging the dwarven pantheon's existence but offering no worship. Meanwhile, in the Mwangi Expanse, there are 2 main ethnic groups. The Mbeke dwarves live in the western Terwa uplands, in and around the sky citadel of Cloudspire. Meanwhile, to the east are the Turalu dwarves, who occupy the land near the Shattered Range Mountains. In the past, the Turalu were more like the Holtaxan mountain dwarves, but the horrors of war they witnessed in the neighboring nation of Geb shifted their culture to one more focused on peace. While there isn't much crossover between the two groups, they both revere the cloud dragons found around their homes, viewing them as sacred creatures. To me, dwarves are defined by the tension between embracing tradition and accepting the world around them. They've always been slight strangers to the surface, and that heritage underground means their traditions may not always fit with the rest of the world. Some have embraced change, some have returned underground, and some have stubbornly tried to put that square peg into the round hole for this entire time. Persistence is a big part of being a dwarf, which I think presents interesting opportunities, both to embrace it and see things through to the end, and to question it. To look at the course of their lives and ask, are we continuing this way because it's right, or just because none of us have ever thought to stop? It's a question you could ask about the other long-lived ancestries of Golarion, and our next subject, Elves. Elves are from Venus. If this surprises you, then you didn't watch my geography video. I don't blame you, that thing's like 2 hours long. But now you know from here! Now I don't mean Venus literally. I mean Castrovel, the second planet from the Sun in the Golarion system, the equivalent of Venus. We don't have time to go into Castrovel today, but the quick and dirty is, before we knew the clouds were covering acid rain-soaked rocks, people thought Venus was some kind of super tropical jungle full of mostly naked aliens. Castrovel is like that version, though the elves do wear normal amounts of clothes. They are taller and slimmer than humans on average. They have ears with long pointed tips and eyes with irises large enough that most people assume they have no whites at all. Elves have a lifespan in centuries, averaging about 600 years. While physically mature by age 25, their culture doesn't consider an elf truly mature until they've reached about 100 years old. Skin color has a similar range to humans, based primarily on where they live. So there's a portal between Castrovel and Golarion powered by a crystal called the Sovereign Stone. It is called this because it links back to the continent of Sovereign on Castrovel, the elves' ancient homeland. It also powers their extensive network of portals on Golarion called the Idara, or Elf Gates, for people that want fewer vowels in their words. These portals are actually very important to the elves' history and how their civilization has spread across Golarion. The elves arrived on the planet before the Age of Legends and were well established when Aslant rose to power with the help of the Algathus from the Shadows. Some elves were aware of the Algathus and their machinations with the surface world, opposing the underwater masters wherever they could. And when the Algathus decided to call down the Starstone and wipe out life on Golarion, the elves made a choice. Warned by their astrologers and diviners, most of the population elected to retreat to Sovereign, abandoning their Golarion territory for the safety of an entirely different planet. Those that didn't flee to their homeland used the Golarion portal network to scatter across the planet instead, remaining behind and developing into their own distinct, isolated cultures. We'll talk about the ones who stayed before discussing the ones who left. Now, the elves who remained fled to various locations all over the Inner Sea, and if you've seen my other videos that touch on elves, you know who we'll be covering first, just to get the elephant in the room out of the way. The Ayandar, aka Cavern Elves, fled underground to escape the coming disaster. Now, if you think that sounds a little bit like an origin for the Drow, well, prior to the remaster, it was. The elves entered the Darklands, became desperate to survive the dangers they found there, and turned to demonic worship to gain power. The remaster retconned them out, so we just won't be talking about them anymore. The current lore of the Ayandar is pretty simple. They live in isolated caverns in the upper level of the Darklands, using magic to sustain themselves in the inhospitable environment. A group of these elves ranged far from home, emerging in distant Tian Sha, where they would be known as the Jinnanese Elves, after the city of Jinin that they founded. The Ayandar haven't had much lore published on them yet, so that's all we have for now, but I look forward to seeing what will eventually be done with them. Heading back above ground, a group of elves headed north into the crown of the world, becoming the Ilverani, or Snowcaster Elves. Generally pale-skinned with white hair, these elves are very isolated from the rest of the world. The crown of the world is a frozen tundra with few reasons to visit. During Earthfall, the Ilverani spent a lot of time and effort helping shelter the other people of Golarion before heading north. Their current culture is insular, very wary of outsiders, to the point where only a specific set of their culture ever interacts with strangers. They also primarily worship the elven goddess Findaladlara, as opposed to the more mainstream Calistria worship you'll see in elven society. Farther south in the deserts of northern Garund, we have the Voronoi, aka the Desert Elves. They live in river valleys and around oases in the desert. Warm, open, and inviting, the Voronoi provide shelter and supplies to anyone traveling through the land. They prefer to solve things peacefully through diplomacy, but are quite capable of defending themselves with powerful magic. They don't see themselves as part of the human nations around them, being independent and highly valuing their freedom. Lastly, we have the Malije Elves, who live in the Mwangi Expanse. Subdivided into 3 separate groups, the Malije all have a darker complexion compared to the elves in Avestan. The 3 tribes of the Malije are the Alije, the Ekuje, and the Kalije. The Alije inhabit the northern jungles of the Expanse and seem primarily concerned with defending an ancient elven city called Nagisa, which is said to contain a great sealed evil. Naturally, a whole bunch of people assume that means free treasure and keep attempting to get inside. I'm sure nothing bad will come of this at all. Anyway, the Ekujay live in the western part of the jungle and are fiercely protective of it, fighting off any outsiders attempting to exploit the abundant natural resources here. Their most frequent opponent is the Aspis Consortium, who are constantly attempting to run off the Ekujay so they can make greater profit from the expanse. The last group of elves here, the Kalijay, live in the northwest jungle between the other two. They are mostly concerned with fighting off the Gorilla King and his forces from the nearby city of Osaro. All of these groups have one thing in common. They have existed on Golarion since Earthfall and developed their own cultures and traditions separate from their Castrovellian counterparts. The elves who left, called the Iodine, would remain off-world until 2632 Absalom Reckoning, when the demon Tree Raiser attempted to take the Sovereign Stone for himself. The elves on the other side of the portal mobilized to defend their home, driving back Tree Raiser and re-establishing their presence on Avestan. They have remained in Kyonin since, and most of what modern people on Golarion think of as elves comes from the Iodine. While nearly 2,000 years have passed since then, the Iodine still see this as a relatively recent change. It's only been a few generations for them, after all. The difference in perspective about time has actually led to some issues for the Iodine. Elves who aren't raised alongside ancestries with similar lifespans find themselves surrounded by people who constantly age and die in the blink of an eye. This constant sense of loss can lead to a melancholy, depressed mood. The elves affected by this are called the Forlorn. While any elf can be a Forlorn, it's more common with Iodine since they are more likely to interact with outsiders. A branch of the Iodine are the Mordant Spire Elves, who live on an island of the same name. The island was originally an elven outpost dedicated to studying the stars and doing a bit of Aslanti spying on the side. When the elves returned to reclaim the outpost, some of them began hearing a voice, the voice of the dead goddess of the moon, Akavna. Now these elves live apart from the mainland, covering themselves in wooden masks and driving off anyone seeking the secrets of old Aslant hidden on the Shattered Continent. So there we have elves, covered in full, which means it's time to cover their descendants, which should only take about half as long. I'm funny, I swear to God. The Ivaran, or half-elves, are a little misleading as a name because they aren't all literally half-elf. At some point, there was a mixture of one elf parent and one non-elf parent, but two Ivaran parents can also have an Ivaran child. Or an Ivaran and a human or elf could have an Ivaran child, though the features will more heavily favor the dominant parentage. In the past, it was believed that only human and elf parent could produce Ivaran, but that isn't the case. It is the most common pairing though, as others often have trouble conceiving or have cultural differences with getting along. Ivarans have a hard time fitting in, inheriting features from both parents that make them stand out in either group. Their age is another factor, being long-lived by human standards but still dying quickly by elven ones. Most Ivarans live in the same community as their parents if they can. Those born to less ideal or loving circumstances often find themselves stuck with whichever parent is more willing to take them in, and can have a hard time growing up. Ivaran circumstances mean they don't have a nation or homeland they can consider theirs, with one tiny exception. In Kyonin, there's a city called Irages, whose population is almost entirely Ivarans. Their relationship with Kyonin is strained, and the elven nation largely does its best to ignore them, treating the town as voluntary exiles. Being aliens is an interesting origin for elves. In many ways, it's similar to the more magical Fey Realm origin you see in other media. Both come from somewhere else, but being from another planet just has a different vibe to it. People in universe might not know the difference, not even the elves themselves in certain cases, but for players the reframing gives you a reason to look at the elves in a different light. They're outsiders, but in a different way than they were before, and it's kind of funny, that's something you could say about our next subject as well. Orcs. This one should be a lot simpler, right? I mean, everyone knows orcs are the bad guys. They're a big evil horde of green people that you just kill until you outlevel them. Easy peasy say parcheesi, right? Well, yes, but actually, no. In fantasy, orcs have a long history of being mindlessly evil. Early editions of D&D had orcs labeled as being always evil aligned. And as long as that's been going on, you've had people questioning it, the constant nature versus nurture kind of debate. As time has gone on, games like D&D and Pathfinder have given people the option to play as orcs, explore their culture, and be individuals instead of just endlessly interchangeable fodder. And if we look at things from their perspective, you see a pretty different picture of the events of history. Earthfall happened, the entire world rattled and shook, causing massive damage to the orcs' underground home. Shaken by this experience, they were given only a few years to recover and rebuild before an invading force of dwarves barged into the area, driving them out of their land and slaughtering anyone who stood to fight. Constantly driven back by a seemingly endless horde of bearded devils, the orcs were pushed to more and more extreme measures to guard their retreat. Their only escape was to enter a strange new world on the surface, full of hostile new creatures, unfamiliar plants, and a horrible burning orb in the sky that was getting brighter every day. See how different things are when you look at it from the orcs' perspective? Their anger and aggression makes a lot more sense now. They are adapted to life in a different environment, with everything on the surface being entirely alien to them. Maybe if they had come to the surface during a more peaceful time, things would be different, but they emerged during the Age of Darkness, where everyone was hostile and competing for resources in a collapsing world. And the dwarves did eventually follow them up, keeping that conflict going. Battle and conflict have come to define their culture as the orcs quite literally carve out a place for themselves in a hostile world. Conquest gave them their nation, the Hold of Belkzen. Named for the leader that united the desperate orcs together to push back against the dwarves, Belkzen struck a powerful blow for his people by taking a dwarf sky citadel and turning it into their capital, Urgir, which remains under orc control to this day. Over the centuries, ambitious warlords have used this aspect of orc culture to augment their own war efforts. Most notably, the Whispering Tyrant Tar-Baphon and the Dragon Warlord Khazavon have treated the Hold of Belkzen as their own infantry fodder farm. While some are fine with this status quo, there are more and more orcs looking at their lot and wondering if there can be some kind of change made around here. Looking at Belkzen first, there are 3 groups of orcs that inhabit the region. Beginning with the most populous, we have the Namathkar orcs. The Namathkar are communal and somewhat nomadic, roaming the plains of the Hold following the various large beasts that make their home there. The Namathkar were the ones most often in conflict with other ancestries, and their culture has become somewhat brutal as a result. Hierarchy is strictly enforced by the strong over the weak. Familial bonds mean everything to them and are what hold the group together. Namathkar are only comfortable around those they trust and will be especially hostile to strangers. The Namathkar are the ones who presently control the city of Urgir. Belkzen isn't all plains though. There's a large silt desert called the Dirt Sea where the Kuldar orcs live. The Kuldar are essentially nocturnal, like all orcs originally were before the surface forced them to alter their sleep schedules. They sleep the day away in collapsible wooden structures buried in the silt, their young standing guard as a way to prove themselves to the group. At night, they roam the Dirt Sea on skiffs and barges pulled by beasts or giants, enjoying the cooler temperature and darker nights that better suit their nature. Finally, we have the Karmaja orcs, who live in the mountains on Belkzen's borders. Living in the high peaks gives them a sense of bravado and recklessness. The Karmaja make daring, dangerous leaps across deadly gaps and deep chasms, never worrying about falling to their deaths. They share their territory with numerous species of drake, which the Karmaja often tame and ride into battle. Young Karmaja children dream of the honor and glory that could be earned by taming the biggest, baddest drake in the region. But Belkzen is not the only place orcs can be found, it's just where they are the most numerous. In the colder regions of the world, the Nanut orcs have adapted to the frigid environment. Mostly found in the land of the Linorm kings, the Nanut live in large communal family units. Non-monogamous, they raise their children communally to forage and hunt. Their much harsher living conditions ironically make them less brutal than other orcs, seeing interpersonal fighting as a waste of time and energy. Disputes are often settled with competitions, typically hunting ones rather than violence. Heading back underground, the Enshrak orcs have gone back into the Darklands, attempting to reclaim their ancient land. They believe that the orcs should never have stayed on the surface. They should have gone back underground after the dwarves emerged, reclaiming their homes and leaving the surface to the creatures more suited for it. They practice traditional rituals and cultivate traditional Darkland foods. Some of them maintain their hatred of dwarven culture and even engage in a reverse for the quest for the sky. Called the Quest for the Cage, they seek to head down into Rovagug's prison and possibly let the ancient god out, which I'm sure will work out great for everybody. The last orc culture we're going to talk about is also the most unique one, at least to me. Down in the Mwangi Expanse, the Matangi orcs also live a life of battle and struggle, but not against other ancestries. No, they have a more important battle to fight, a battle against demons. The Matangi are highly respected by the other residents of the Expanse for their ferocity in fighting the demons that roam the jungle. They cover their bodies in protective tattoos and their territory in defensive runic carvings that are incredibly distinct and promise safety to anyone who wanders into the territory. The Matangi occupy a very different space than the more stereotypical orcs you'll find in Avestan, and people from that continent often find the locals' relationship with the Matangi a little strange. Like the Elves, there's one other subject we need to talk about with the Orcs, and unfortunately they are a lot less pleasant to talk about. Dromar, also called half-orcs, are similar to Ivarans with regards to parentage. They are more likely to be the result of an orc parent and a non-orc parent, usually humans, than Ivarans are. The traits they share with their orc parents can range from subtle to very distinct, but green skin and large tusks are both most common signs. Now, there's no easy way to say this, so we'll just get it over with. Given the more antagonistic relationship between orcs and other ancestries on Golarion, many Dromar were not conceived intentionally. The resulting children are generally ostracized or abandoned. There are exceptions, for example, the Matangi orcs don't have the same stigma, but on Avestan a Dromar is generally considered an outsider. There aren't really any Dromar societies or settlements except for one in the Ironbound Islands called Avaraka. Most Dromars are individualistic people, looking out for themselves and anyone they have grown to trust in their years alive. But their position in Orc society is slowly shifting, as more and more of their unique strengths and talents have been recognized by their brethren. Orcs have a fraught history in fantasy and RPGs. There's a lot of bad tropes associated with how they were portrayed that simply weren't questioned for a long time. Even now, you'll find people just wanting them to be evil bad guys to beat up. And I get that you need antagonists and don't always want to have deep questions about who you're fighting, but it makes a more interesting fleshed out world to consider the perspective of all the people in that world. When it comes to mindlessly evil monsters, the game already has plenty of those to draw on without depicting an entire culture in the same light. The orcs are people, and that makes them a lot more interesting in my eyes. Speaking of interesting, okay, this transition is a lot less clever, but it is a little different, and that's going to make all the difference with gnomes. Gnomes are kind of weird when you think about them. Let me demonstrate what I mean. Close your eyes and picture a random gnome. So did you picture a small creature that lives in the woods and talks to random rodents? Or did you picture a tiny science genius that makes gadgets and gizmos? Double or, did you picture a ceramic guy that your grandma has in her garden? And that's what I mean. Dwarves, elves, and orcs all had a fairly solid fantasy genre stereotype to either lean into, move away from, or twist in some way. Gnomes are far less unified, which gives us more places to go, but a different starting place to work with. It's telling, I think, that gnomes are the only ancestry we're talking about today that aren't in Lord of the Rings. But that's enough about gnomes in other stories, let's talk about gnomes in Pathfinder. Gnomes are about 3 feet tall, generally thin and lanky. They weigh about as much as a human child, even when fully grown. Their heads are slightly larger than other humanoids and have a subtly different shape. This can be difficult to notice because gnomes also tend to have incredibly wild hair. The color can be almost anything, from normal hues to rainbow curls to poofy pastel afros. Not just color, but texture and how it falls can also have wild variations as well. Think of it like having anime protagonist hair. Gnome skin tones can be a little more down to earth, similar to human skin tones, but it's not uncommon to find green, blue, or black tinge to them either. There is one other thing about gnomes' appearance, but for that to make sense, we need to go over their history. Now, if everything I've told you seems a little out there, you're right to think that, because gnomes are from another world, specifically the First World. The First World is sort of an extraplanar blueprint for reality, a quite literal first draft. Magic, physics, and reality are all a little bit more fluid there, and it's now home to all manner of fey creatures. And for a long time, that included the gnomes. But that changed in negative 4202 when a large number of them migrated into the universe. We don't know why they did this, though there are theories. But this migration fundamentally changed the gnomes. Creatures of the First World don't have true souls and can't die the same way mortals can. When the gnomes came over, they gained true souls and entered into the cycle of life and death that all mortals share. This manifested in a strange phenomena that affects the entire ancestry. Theoretically, gnomes have an incredibly long lifespan, around as long as elves, but in practical terms, gnomes live about 400 years, but there's a little bit more to it. Gnomes crave excitement, novelty, and stimulation. When they don't get that, the color literally drains from their body in a process called the bleaching. The bleaching causes the gnome's hair, skin, and eyes to turn a dull gray color and their body to start showing signs of rapid aging, sometimes looking far older than they are. This condition also has a psychological effect on the gnome, similar to depression, which makes it harder to find excitement and novelty needed to fight the condition. It can be reversed if caught in time, but it cannot be prevented. Though this process is usually fatal, the gnomes deteriorating in a painful downward spiral, some can find a kind of peace within it and stabilize, becoming bleachlings. These gnomes have the dark muted color of the bleaching, but stop showing the rapid aging. They no longer need constant new stimulation and have a muted, detached relationship with their emotions. They will still die of old age, but will spend the rest of their life disconnected from their society, who see their own painful future in every interaction. Because of their origin, gnomes don't have the same kind of homeland that other ancestries do, and actively avoid being tied down to any one community. Therefore, gnomish groups are a lot more determined by their environment, especially the ambient magic surrounding it, so these variants are going to sound a little different from the previous section. We'll start with the most common ones, the Feychild gnomes. These gnomes have a strong connection to their ancestral home, being drawn to areas of great natural wonder and primal magic. Their strong connection to the First World literally brightens them up, Feychild having the most outrageous variation in their hair, skin, and eye color. This connection isn't entirely stable, which makes Feychild gnomes more susceptible than others to the horrible effects of the bleaching. They need more stimulation more often to get the same results as other gnomes, which means they tend to take more risks and get in more trouble, but also live one hell of a life. Speaking of the First World though, it is not all sunshine and rainbows. It has just as many dark shadows and creepy crawlies, which the Fel gnomes embody perfectly. Gnomes who grow up around areas of darker, more occult magic gain more exaggerated features which veer hard into the uncanny valley. Their sense of humor is darker and more macabre, and their actions tend to be a little bit more dangerous to bystanders as a result. They aren't inherently cruel or malicious, but many don't bother to hide or fight their darker instincts. Shifting quite a bit, we have the Glimmer Gnomes. Originally called Glamour Gnomes, the name has shifted over time. These gnomes mature around areas of divine magical manifestation or areas of very devout worship. The divine sparks present in these places interact oddly with the gnomes' First World connections, giving them the power to subtly shift and alter reality around them. This makes them masters of illusion magic and gives their features a radiant metallic glow. Some Glimmer Gnomes will play up their divine connections, passing themselves off as godlings or scions of the eldest of the First World. It's not all fun and games though, because this influence can include more sinister divine powers like Zon-Cathon or Rovagug. Whatever the source of their spark, Glimmer Gnomes make the most of it before it dies out. Lastly, we have the nerds of the bunch, the Keenspark Gnomes. Coming of age in areas saturated with arcane magic, Keenspark Gnomes seek novelty not by finding what the world has to offer, but by trying to create something new. Their outward appearance is the most drab of gnomish kind, but their zest for exploration and experimentation is no less strong. Their dedication to their chosen research can often result in strict perfectionism that non-gnomes find off-putting. But that same dedication also leads to them being the foremost experts in whatever field they have decided to pursue. I'll also take a minute to note an offshoot of gnomes that live in the Darklands called the Drathnalar. They are very different from surface gnomes and more connected to the First World. That's as far as we'll go for now, but I wanted to give them a few lines just in case people asked. So that's gnomes. Personally, I quite like the unique approach Paizo was taken with them. They draw on various familiar gnome tropes while not being a direct copy. They give you a chance to go out there with character design elements, and their curiosity is something that really resonates with me. I want to see everything the world has to offer. It's why I started making these videos. What cool thing could be in the next book, on the next page? What secret will we learn, and how will it open up more secrets to be uncovered? Their wild wandering nature also presents a good contrast to the next subject we're going to be covering, which is... Halflings. You ever wonder why they started being called halflings? In-universe, I mean. Here in the real world, we know the reason is because IP law prevents using a different term that starts with H. Still, it's kind of odd to define your entire ancestry by how it's measured against other ancestries. But it also does make a bit of sense when you look at halfling history, or rather lack thereof. Communities and families have their own histories, same as everyone else, but there isn't the same defining cultural change like the quest for the sky displacing the orcs and dwarves, or the elven or gnomish migrations to Golarion from their other homes. Halflings have just always been around. We know they predate Earthfall, with a prominent ethnicity living in Thassalon, and that there are records of halflings as far back as ancient Assyrian, but that's about it. Physically, halflings are short, around 3 feet tall like gnomes, but much broader. They have large, flat feet, which tend to grow quite a bit of hair. The soles of those feet are tougher than most ancestries, and it's not uncommon to see halflings just not wearing shoes. They're also quite lucky. It's weird to quantify, but halflings have a lot more luck than the average person. It's not always a dramatic amount of luck, and it's not always going to get them out of everything, but a halfling is going to flip the right face or roll the right number more often than anyone else. Why? Well, no one can really say, but it's consistent enough to be notable, with halflings viewing luck as a personal attribute and the lack of it as something of a moral failing. Halfling society also values freedom and autonomy. That makes a lot of sense. Halflings are smaller and, on average, weaker physically than a lot of the other ancestries around them. But they are hardy, diligent, and capable of great things when properly motivated. Or improperly, as the case is with the people exploiting them. Halfling communities are frequent targets of slavers, and as a result, halflings make up the most staunch abolitionists in the Inner Sea. They practically run the Bellflower Network, a group of anti-slavery freedom fighters who work to free people from bondage and guide them to safety. Their tendency to be overlooked by the taller ancestries perfectly positions them to act as spies and information brokers. While halflings have their own distinct ethnic groups, there is one they share with humans, and it's also the darkest one to discuss, so we're going to get it over with now. Warning, this section contains information that parallels some ugly real-world history, and if that makes you uncomfortable, skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen. Chelaxian halflings are, by and large, slaves and the descendants of slaves. Some are forced to do work that benefits from quick fingers and sharp eyes, like creating textiles or sorting and picking crops. Others are used for domestic work like cleaning, cooking, valet service, and similar tasks. Both are considered second-class citizens and face frequent abuse from their owners, as well as the implicit threat that comes with living every day knowing your death is considered a property crime and doesn't carry the same legal ramifications of a real murder. Chelaxian halflings are not meekly accepting of their lot in life. Many of them are deeply involved in the Bellflower Network and risk their lives every day to free their brothers and sisters from bondage. Family and community solidarity are extremely important, and any Chelaxian halfling that betrays others for personal gain is ostracized, being referred to as an impkin for cozying up to their devil-worshipping masters. A little spoiler for the future, this aspect of things is going to shift eventually, but for now, be mindful of this part of Cheliax and halflings. Moving along to nicer pastures, we have the Jerichs, halflings who live in the barrier mountains of northern Garund. Living on the peaks gives Jerich halflings a stockier and more muscular build to better handle their nomadic lifestyle in a rough land. They're also a little more rough and tumble, breaking into friendly fights and wrestling matches with one another. Jerichs live in small groups, usually only a few dozen, but will band together as the need arises. Larger groups will usually live farther down the mountains, while smaller groups live farther up. Within the community, like-minded Jerichs will create what are called bill bands. Bill bands are roughly half gang, half club, with grand names like Flynn's Fireflingers. Sometimes these names have a connection and meaning to the bill band, but most of the time they're just something that sounds cool. Heading north, right on the border of Avestan and Kazmaron in the nation of Iabaria, we have the Merini halflings. Living in the colder climates, these halflings are thinner than average, with sharper chins and wider ears. Centuries ago, they lived all throughout Iabaria and the land that is now Brevoy, but their modern numbers are quite low. The choking plague devastated the community, and the Merini have never properly recovered. Their current population is scattered throughout northern Avestan, constantly on the move. Their nomadic lifestyle is a little different from other nomads, being rooted in fleeing disaster rather than other migration patterns. The Merini don't move to follow a seasonal change or an animal herd, they move because they find survival is easier when fleeing danger. This life means they have almost no permanent residences or written history, carrying it with them in the form of oral traditions. The constant wandering often leaves them anxious, and most carry a small piece of sturdy string called a halinet to act as a bit of a fidget tool. Far to the south in the Mwangi Expanse, the Songo halflings live very differently. Many halflings in the Expanse are integrated with the other cultures that call that place home, simply living alongside those other ancestries. The Songo are different, living isolated in the Laughing Jungles. Already wary of outsiders, the founding of Sargava and the coming of Chelish slavers have only made the Songo more reclusive, determined to keep themselves safe from these dangerous newcomers. This isolation has preserved their unique culture, which cherishes a unique, fleeting form of art. Things like sculptures meant to break down over time, or music made of impromptu instruments that can never be performed the same way twice. Their clothing is multi-layered but thin to avoid overheating in the jungle, making for a unique fabric prized by the few people from outside their culture that the Songo trust to trade with them. The Songo are an interesting view of halfling culture that isn't tied to a different ancestry, but wholly their own. Living in a very different forest, the Ulam halflings inhabit the large Verduran forest of Avestan. The Ulams have inhabited the Verduran for centuries and often live a life of simple pleasures in their well-kept homes. With little outside danger threatening them, most Ulam halflings dedicate themselves to an intricate craft, which they hope to hone through years of dedication and hard work. The Ulams are the most settled halflings in the Inner Sea, many wanting nothing more than to live a simple, fulfilling life. They can be quite generous with friends and family, enjoying the feeling of people taking comfort from the efforts they put into making something, be it a warm blanket or a hearty meal. They might be the least unique of all the halflings, but that suits their lifestyle just fine. The final group of halflings don't exist anymore. The Othaban halflings were an ethnicity that lived in the ancient Thassalon prior to Earthfall. There isn't a lot known about their culture, Earthfall having wiped most of them out. The survivors fell in with the various local populations of humans and integrated with them, evolving into the current halfling cultures. Well, why bring them up if they're extinct? Well, let's just say we might see them in the future after some shenanigans occur. Halflings have an interesting dynamic with human societies on Golarion. They are the most deeply integrated with the human nations they live in compared to the other ancestries. This can at first make them seem almost forgettable, more like a footnote to humans instead of their own culture. But I think this status suits most halflings. It frees them from larger scale worries and lets them get along with society on their own terms. Overlooked can just be another term for left alone if you think about it. And as Cheliax is learning, when they aren't left alone, their ability to organize and fight back from just under your nose is a skill to be feared and respected. Their stature is small, but so are you when they bring you down to your knees. Flashbang transition! Goblins. Pretty random and chaotic, right? Well, that's a good way to describe goblins. Nasty, messy, green little guys that run around and destroy, well, just about everything because they can, right? What else can you expect from goblins? They're a low-level nuisance, there for some easy fights or as fodder for a real monster to throw at heroes. They're kind of generic in most fantasy. So what did Paizo do to make them memorable and interesting? They made them quirky. Let's find out how. Goblins are small, at only around 3 feet tall, and incredibly light. A goblin with a triple-digit weight is almost unheard of, even for their most healthy kind. Their skin is generally green in color, though that changes depending on where they live, which implies their skin coloration is camouflage of some sort. Their heads are flat and oval-shaped, with sunken eyes that generally glow red, a bit like hot coals. Their mouths have barely any lip and are usually open to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Now you might be wondering why I, Dina, don't look like that. The simple answer is I'm half gnome on my dad's side. I get a lot of traits from him. No one is sure where goblins originate, though their oral tradition does give a mythological origin for goblin kind. It centers around 4 legendary barghists. Now, normal barghists are dangerous fiends that get stronger by killing and can resemble either goblins or wolves by choice. But there are 4 demigods of their kind that goblins believe the goddess Lamashtu stole from the kennels of Asmodeus centuries ago. These 4 demigods are Hadragash, Venkelvor, Zarangel, and Zogmagot. Goblins believe their kind was created when these 4 killed a human and spilled its blood on the ground. From that blood rose the goblins, who were each given a gift by their creators before being sent on their way. Hadragash taught the goblins how to function as a tribe so that they could be stronger together. Venkelvor gave them an endless hunger so they would always strive to move forward in the world. Zarangel gave them a connection to the wild beasts, letting goblins ride wolves and their strange goblin dogs easily. And lastly, Zogmagot showed them how to survive along coastlines, scrounging and fishing for what they needed. Is any of this true? Well, I mean, those 4 demigods do seem to exist, and there is some kind of connection between barghists and goblins, so it's possible some version of that story did indeed happen. But that's not as important as how these stories tie into goblins in the modern day. And to see how that works, we need to look at how goblins interact with other ancestries. Which brings us to the Rasp goblins. Named for the region of Varesia where they are most often found, Rasp goblins embody many traits common among goblin cultures, but the interactions between them and the people around them has painted a skewed perspective of goblin kind. One thing to keep in mind is that goblins don't live as long as other ancestries, only about 60 years max with a much lower average. Their living conditions are generally poor, and they have a strange, nearly universal fascination with fire that is often deadly. Adding on to this, goblins have a cultural aversion to reading and writing. They believe it steals words and thoughts from your head and will avoid it if they can. While some have invented unique ways of preserving language in books, like picture books to teach spellcasting or a rudimentary scratch and sniff for formulas, many simply reject books on sight. Goblins pass down information through oral tradition, most often in song. Goblins also have a strong affinity for animals, especially wolves and the strange hairless creatures called goblin dogs. This affinity extends to magical creatures like wargs, but those relationships are a bit more transactional. Fitting their mythological origin, goblins revere Barghests and will often worship or follow them. The only animals goblins don't seem to have this affinity with are dogs and horses, which they seem to instinctively distrust and culturally revile. This dovetails with worship of Lamashtu, the mother of monsters, which is far more common in goblin society than other ancestries. She represents the wild, undomesticated animals, and you won't find many animals more domesticated than dogs or horses. So how do the rasp goblins fit into all this? Well, Longshanks, goblin slang for non-goblins, mostly but not exclusively humans, have been moving into Varesia more and more in recent times, which brought them into contact with rasp goblins. Now how do you think these Longshanks settlers reacted to loud pyromaniacs that worshipped a demonic goddess and rode dangerous predators with a habit of killing two of the most important domestic animals for settling a frontier? Yeah, not great. This isn't to say it was entirely defenseless goblins being unfairly attacked. Lamashtu worshippers are generally as bad as they're made out to be, but the resulting conflict seriously damaged the local goblin population, killing off many of the older, technically wiser members of the group. This had two effects. Firstly, any goblin that didn't want to be part of this conflict fled into areas less occupied by Longshanks, which protected them and allowed them to rebuild, but limited their contact with outsiders. The second group of goblins were those that didn't retreat. Forced to grow up without leaders to teach them, these goblins essentially had to piece together their own culture from the children's versions of their songs. The result was a bunch of goobers running around, lighting things on fire, singing creepy songs. And when those were the only kind of goblins you see, well, stereotypes start to form. Now that all sounds rather tragic, and in some ways it is. But things aren't all bad. For starters, rasp goblins aren't the only kind of goblin there are on Golarion. These variants have different relationships with their environment and the cultures around them, so we'll look at them before we circle back to the rasp goblins. These others do share quite a few goblin traits mentioned earlier, but are a lot less childish in how they manifest. Starting with the smallest population, we have the monkey goblins of Mediogalti Island. Taller and heavier than other goblins, the most distinctive trait of the monkey goblins is their tail, which is what gives them their name. Living in the treetops of their jungle island home, monkey goblins have the same love of fire as their tailless cousins, which works out about as well as you'd think it would for creatures that live in trees. While the majority of their population does stick to the island, more and more monkey goblins have found themselves at home on a Shackles pirate ship, where their boisterous singing, gleeful chaos, and quick climbing prowess fit right in with other pirates. Many crews consider monkey goblins good luck and insist each ship have one, though two is pushing it. Sticking to the trees but heading further north, the forest goblins largely make their home in the coniferous woods of Avestan, the largest population hailing from Isger's Chitterwood. Fairly reclusive, forest goblins only venture out from the trees to scavenge for something they can't make or find elsewhere. While you might first assume they're a danger to the forest they live in, forest goblins are actually the opposite. They have the same love of fire as other goblins, but a robust tradition of fire safety and management that keeps it from raging out of control. In fact, forests with them in it are very healthy. The goblins control burns, helping foster growth and prevent truly devastating wildfires. Recently, the tribes of the Chitterwood were recruited in an assault on Isger, which resulted in the Goblin Blood Wars, laying waste to large parts of the country. Though Isger won the war, most of the goblins retreated back to the trees, where they remain, though many of them are now even more wary of involvement in outside conflict. Lastly, we have the Frost Goblins, who have adapted to the eternal winter of Irisin. Their skin is a pale blue instead of green, and they handily resist colder temperatures. They have spread across the northern part of Avestan, where the cold is still present much of the year. Though they live in tribes like other goblins, the Frost Goblins are not as loathed as the southern goblin tribes. Frost Goblins still live on the fringe of society, but more by choice than necessity. Which brings us back around to the Rasp Goblins. Despite the hardships and difficulties, things are starting to look up. The reckless goblin raiders may still be in the majority, but that behavior is just as likely to get them in an early grave as it is to make them tribe leader. Newer generations have seen what those actions have caused and are wondering if this is maybe not the best way to handle things. They don't have to stop being goblins, but maybe they don't have to fight the Longshanks either. Maybe, just maybe, we be heroes too. I'm funny. Paizo's goblins are an iconic part of the Pathfinder brand. Silly, chaotic, and generally good for a laugh, they started off as quirky but one note. As we learn more about the world and start to find out what does and does not resonate with people, there was a push to explore goblins more, to give them some spotlight and a chance to shine just like anyone else. And I think Paizo has done a good job of doing that while recontextualizing the old things we knew to keep the goblins just as fun and goofy, but still give them a rich culture of their own. So that's everyone, right? All the neat fantasy ancestries covered nice and quick, don't check the video's runtime. So, thank you for watching, Pathfinders, and, I feel like I forgot one. We got the tall ones, the squat ones, the short ones, the other short ones, the green short ones, the green tall ones. Who am I missing? Who, of course, the boring ones. Humans. Okay, this one will be short. You know what a human is, you probably are one. Unless autoplay showed this to someone's dog while they were asleep or something. You know, just in case. Who's a good puppy? You are. You're a good doggy. Yes, you are. Look, I need to have fun somehow, okay? Okay, but what about their history, their lore? I said so much about dwarves and elves and goblins. Humans must have some rich history too, right? Yeah, they do. The problem is, since humans are the dominant ancestry on the planet at the moment, their stories are the histories of their nations. And I already spent 2 hours on that just covering the basics. And I can't talk about their physiology because, again, you know what a human is. But we do have a few things we can go over, so let's run through the basic history before breaking down the most prominent ethnic groups in the Inner Sea. This is going to be really quick and rapid fire compared to the other stuff, just because, again, it is so tied into these cultures that it only makes sense to explore them in their own videos. So the most interesting thing about humans in Pathfinder is that they were made by evil psychic fish. The Algathu are an ancient race from another planet entirely who have existed on Golarion since before history. Extremely arrogant, they believe themselves the true masters of the world, more so than anyone else, including divinities. And so they engineered a species to control the surface, defeating the Sekhmet serpent folk that ruled it before and controlling their puppets from the shadows. The Aslanti humans were those puppets. All modern humans broadly descend from the Aslanti, though many of the advantages the Algathu engineered into their creations have been lost over evolution. The Aslanti prospered, but got a little too smart for their own good. They uncovered evidence of the Algathu, and in response, the Veiled Masters tried to wipe the slate clean. Earthfall happened and humanity fractured. The two human empires, Aslant and Thassalon, died in Earthfall, the survivors turning into barely surviving nomads and scattered tribes. Some of Thassalon's people survived through various means, but of the Aslanti, only Aridin remained after the Age of Darkness. He tried to guide and protect his people for a time, but found himself wandering as new generations got farther and farther from those who he remembered. When he ascended, it would be as the last of the Aslanti. Now following his death, the line of the Aslanti is well and truly dead. No Starfinder players, you keep quiet, I see you there, we'll get to you eventually, we'll get to it. Anyway, while all humans are descended from the Aslanti, it's been thousands of years and people have changed. There are quite a few ethnic human groups, so we'll run down them pretty quickly in alphabetical order, because that's how the book did it. This is page 19 of the script, and I am rapidly going insane. The Arutaki are humans that live in the far north, technically off the continent of Avestan and the crown of the world. Nomadic and very aware of how harsh their homeland is, the Arutaki are resilient and very wary of outsiders, but can generally be counted on to help the various caravans that navigate their frozen home. Arutaki are shorter than average and have a weathered, tanned appearance. The Garundi are the people who live in the northern part of Garund, between the inner sea coast and the mountains. Sometimes called the Siriani due to the large amount of control that nation held over the surrounding area, the Garundi have a rich history. They founded some of the first nations to rise up after Earthfall, and their contributions to humanity as a whole have shaped every nation born since. Garundi are taller than average, with skin tones ranging from tawny to dark brown. The Kelishites are often mixed with the Garundi, coming from the neighboring continent of Kazmaron. The Kelishite Empire has an extensive history of expansion into the Inner Sea, and while the Empire hasn't had much success, its people have still spread far and wide. The Kelishite Empire is a bit of a melting pot, but most favor a lean build and bronze to tawny skin. The Kelids are a tribal people that once roamed all of Avestan, but now largely live in the northern parts of the continent below the crown of the world. Many of them maintain the nomadic lifestyle they adopted after Earthfall, seeing no need to change what is clearly working. Various cultural incidents in Numeria, Irisen, and the World Wound have left many Kelid tribes deeply distrustful of magic, preferring to do things with their own strength of arms. Kelids are tall and broad, with a lightly tanned skin tone. The Mwangi are actually several distinct cultures that inhabit the Mwangi Expanse. I covered them all in my history video, but a quick rundown. The Zenge are the most numerous of the Mwangi people, settling all over the Expanse. The Mauzi live in the northern regions, near the border mountains, and intermingle with the Garundi extensively. The Bekyar are fishers and occasionally raiders that live along the southwestern coast. And lastly, the Banuwat are traders and seafarers, sailing up and down the western coast of Garund. Each group has a broad array of dark skin tones. The Nidalese are unique, coming from a single country in the Inner Sea. Nadal was preserved by Zon Cathan after Earthfall, and this has affected the Nidalese people. They appear slender and delicate, with pale, ashen skin. Most simply keep their head down and try to live their lives, avoiding the ones whose darker impulses have led them into the service of the Midnight Lord. The Shoanti are a nomadic people who live in Varesia. Originally they lived all over the region, but colonists have forced them out of the lowlands and onto the Stroval Plateau. The Shoanti live in clans that they call Kwa, which have various skills and duties they perform for their people as a whole. Most Shoanti adults shave their head and often have elaborate tattoos covering their tan, tawny skin. Taldans come from East Avestan and once ruled much of the Inner Sea, spreading their culture and language all across the world. While Taldor itself has shrunk considerably, the Taldan people still control most of southern Avestan. The fact that most of the current nations in that region broke from Taldor means that a lot of them don't necessarily think of themselves as Taldans, but it still works as an umbrella term, no matter how much the people of Cheliax protest. Taldans generally have fair skin with darker tans among the working class. Tian is a broad term for people from the eastern continent of Tian Sha. That's an entire continent's worth of cultures that we do not have time for, so I'll just leave it at this. The Tian people come from a massive array of cultures, but often find themselves lumped together while on Avestan. The Ulfen come from northern Avestan, but have traveled all over the world. Coming from a cold land with little farming available, many Ulfen take to the sea in longboats looking to make their fortunes. Tall, broad, and fair-skinned, usually with impressive reddish beards, the Ulfen make for a striking sight among other humans. They were also the first to make contact with the people living on distant Arcadia, which has its own group of humans that we will cover another time. Varisians come from Varisia, obviously, and are a nomadic people. Where the Ulfen go by sea, the Varisians go by land, covering nearly every nation in Avestan at some point. Sharing a cultural connection with both the stars and the goddess Desna, Varisians are also associated with the Harrow deck, a collection of cards they believe can divine a person's future. Varisians are generally short on average, with tawny, golden, or brown skin tones. And lastly we have the Vudrani, who come from the impossible kingdoms of Vudra on Kazmaron. Having come to the Inner Sea by way of trade with Jalmaray, the Vudrani are a small slice of the vast culture that exists in their homeland. Vudrani culture revolves around a sense of self-perfection and continued improvement which constantly drives them. They tend to have slight builds and brown to umber skin tones. And that's not even close to all the humans. Most of these you could probably break down into a few separate ethnic groups as well, but those are very closely tied to the nation they are from and therefore, to me, fit better in a dedicated video. Despite my bit earlier, the humans of the Inner Sea have a wide variety of interesting cultures and traditions, even if their familiarity makes a lot of people overlook them for the more fantastical ancestries Pathfinder has to offer. And that, Pathfinders, is the real end of this video. Thank you for sticking with me while I went through all these core ancestries. It's not even close to everything Pathfinder has to offer in terms of cultures. Just limiting myself to the ones with playable stats, we still have the robotic androids, lizard folk, 2 different kinds of plant people, face sprites, skeletons, extraplanar scions, cosmically alive wood, and 4-armed psychic rhinos. That last one get your attention? I hope so, because I plan to cover all of them eventually, but for now, I've got to get going. Thank you for watching, check the description for support links, do all the fun YouTube stuff I know you know how to do because you're very smart, and until next time, explore, report, and cooperate.